You don't even have a card in your own name," my husband laughed, loud enough for the entire bank line to hear. The teller glanced at me with that look, the one that says, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." Then the manager walked out, looked straight past my husband, looked straight at me and said, "Ma'am, we've been expecting you." My name is Danielle Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life being the kind of person that people overlook without thinking twice about it. I'm not loud. I don't demand credit. I've always been the one in the background, keeping the pieces in place while someone else got to stand at the front and take the bow. I worked as a part-time bookkeeper, handling small accounts, tracking numbers, fixing errors nobody else wanted to find. While my husband's business grew, I was the one making sure the foundation didn't crack, the budgets, the projections, the quiet corrections nobody ever thanked me for. On paper, he built everything. In reality, I kept everything from falling apart. But in my marriage, in his eyes, and eventually in the eyes of his whole family, I was just help. No impressive degree, no title, no spotlight. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that loyalty was its own kind of reward. I believed that one day he would turn around and say, "I couldn't have done this without you." I kept waiting. I kept working. I kept being quiet. I was wrong to do that for as long as I did. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, like your effort was absorbed by someone else and your name never attached to any of it, please hit subscribe. I want you to hear this story, and I want you to know that I see you. It started with a trip to the bank. My husband decided I needed to learn how things work, which I understood immediately as something else entirely. It was a performance. He wanted an audience for how much he knew and how little I did. The moment we walked in, he set the tone. He told the banker, "She doesn't understand finances, just focus on me." I tried to ask a question about one of the accounts, a specific detail I already knew the answer to, and he cut me off. "That's not your concern," he laughed. "Everything we own is in my name. She'd honestly be lost without me." A few people in line shifted uncomfortably. Someone smiled. The teller kept her expression very still. The bank manager was passing through the floor when she heard the exchange. She slowed down. She looked at me, not at him, and then she asked, in a calm and steady voice, if she could speak with me privately for a moment. I said yes before I even thought about it. But before that meeting happened, I need to tell you what the months before it looked like, because nothing about that day in the bank arrived without history. My husband began removing me from business conversations completely. "You slow things down," he said, as if my questions were an inconvenience rather than the reason half his decisions hadn't blown up yet. Then came the documents, papers he'd slide across the table and ask me to sign for tax reasons, waving his hand like the details were boring and I was too simple to follow them. I started reading before signing. He didn't like that. The worst moment came at a family dinner. He was talking about how well the business was doing, his voice full and warm with pride, and someone asked what I contributed. He smiled. Danielle wouldn't last a week on her own. Everyone laughed. Not cruelly, just easily, the way people laugh when a joke lands without them checking if it's true. I sat at that table and felt the temperature of that room settle into my chest like cold water. But something shifted in me that night. I stopped reacting. I started watching. I went back through old files, the kind of files I'd kept for years just to stay organized, because that's how I work. Printed records, saved emails, a handful of voice notes I'd recorded after meetings so I wouldn't forget the details. I wasn't building a case, I was just doing what I always did, keeping track. But when I started laying everything out late at night at the kitchen table, the smell of old paper mixing with cold coffee, I began seeing something I hadn't noticed before. Certain accounts had been registered in ways my husband clearly hadn't examined closely. He'd been focused on the big picture, the deals, the handshakes. He had let me handle the paperwork because paperwork bored him. And in that paperwork, tied up in the fine print he never read, my name appeared in places he didn't expect. What they didn't know was that I had kept copies of everything. And what I didn't know yet was what those copies actually meant. I reached out to an old family lawyer. He'd known my husband's family for years, but when I came to him alone, he treated me with a seriousness I wasn't used to. He sat across from me, adjusted his glasses, and started reading. The room was very quiet. The clock on his wall ticked steadily, and it felt like the only sound in the world. He looked up and said, "Danielle, do you realize what this means?" Several assets were legally tied to me through structures my husband had overlooked or simply never investigated. He'd assumed his name was on everything that mattered. He was wrong. I kept that information close. I told no one. I waited. The day came when my husband arranged a major transaction at the bank, a large financial move he'd been building toward for months. He brought me along, I think, out of habit, or maybe because he liked having a witness to his success. He walked into that meeting the way he always walked into rooms, like the outcome was already decided. The bank manager was there, the lawyer was there. I sat quietly while my husband began talking, his voice filling the space easily. "She's just here to observe," he said when the manager glanced at me. The lawyer set down his pen and said, "Actually, she is the primary account holder on several of the relevant assets." The room went very still. My husband's smile held for a second before it didn't. "That's not possible," he said. The manager confirmed it. The documents were clear. Signatures, account structures, registration records, all of it laid out on the table in plain language. My husband looked at me the way people look when the ground moves under them and they can't find a wall to grab. I kept my voice steady and calm when I finally spoke. "You told me I owned nothing," I said. "Turns out you never checked." I declined the transaction. I had every legal right to, and I did. He had no authority in that room. He stood there while the papers said something different than everything he'd believed for years. He had built his confidence on an assumption he never verified. I walked out of that bank without rushing, without raising my voice, without looking back more than once. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. I separated my finances and started rebuilding on terms that were mine. The family's tone changed after that, softer, more careful, but I wasn't interested in their adjustment. That moment had passed. My husband faced the weight of his own choices. That was no longer my problem to carry. They thought silence was the same as weakness. They thought patience was the same as submission. They were wrong about both. Silence is sometimes where you do your clearest thinking, and patience, real patience, is just strength that knows how to wait. If someone has made you feel like you don't matter in your own life, like your name doesn't belong on anything that counts, I want you to hear this. They are working with incomplete information. Subscribe, share this, click hype if this story reached you somewhere real, and leave your story in the comments because you deserve to be heard too. Did this hit home? Like the video and let me know. Your support helps this reach someone who needs it right now.